Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to go through an AP course. I originally was going to do a series about AP pre-calculus. That'll just be a standalone video, it'll come out later. But we're going to go to one of the newer courses that's debuting this year for everyone, AP African American Studies. This is video number 1, going over the idea of ancestral Africa, basically the sections that you need to learn 1.1 through the first half of 1.11. So, beginning with an ancient land and people. So, the African climate and its impact on development. African climate, a long time ago, the area known as the Sahara Desert today was very green. As it started to turn into more of a desert-like condition, people either had to move north or south towards it. Today, or in this video, what we'll be focusing on is people who move south. Moving south meant moving their agriculture from the Sahara Desert and migrating themselves and their families down towards Western Africa, also getting more. There was a change in animals because of the different climate. There were flies which attacked horses, killed a lot of horses. So camels became one of the bigger types of animals in Western Africa. Also, this look at the change in climate of Africa is something which can be seen in the Bantu dispersion. Basically, the Bantu of what could be considered southern Western Africa. Basically, as the climate became a little more inhospitable for their crops, a lot of the people, the Bantu, had to move towards, if you're in an area with unhospitable crops, move somewhere where you can live and sustain life. So the Bantu moved to areas where they could grow more crops. Basically, this could be east, into search of more like rainforest type areas, or it could be south. Bantu dispersion, this is really how a lot of people move from Western Africa towards what some would consider maybe Eastern Africa and Southern Africa today. A lot of that area was started to be, people started to live there, or a lot more lived there based on the Bantu dispersion. Basically, the main idea you should remember from this is that the Bantu were looking for a place to grow crops because the area they lived in were unhospitable for the crops that they had or they were growing. Another idea, an important idea, I guess, with new research which has come up, and an important idea, I guess, people would say in the field of African American studies is the idea of iron technology in Africa. The idea of iron technology in Africa was not something which was imported to Africa from a different culture. Iron technology was independently developed in Africa. And basically, the place it was, was famously invented, or the main place was invented in Africa, was the Jos Plateau, in around 600 BCE. So iron technology was independently the use of iron technology in Africa, or more specifically West Africa, was an independent invention by the people of West Africa. And then there's this idea of bronze technology, also independently produced by the people of Africa. I guess more with the bronze technology, it's important to get into the idea of bronze was very important in West Africa, or even in African cultures. In certain places, bronze was their form of currency. There were different spheres of influence. You would trade bronze for like mid-tier items. Maybe that would be cattle or other items of the sort. Um, so yeah, bronze was important. You could trade a lot of bronze. And the form of exchange wasn't just bronze itself, it was bronze rods. And those bronze rods could be traded for a variety of items. If you have enough bronze rods, you could get some gold paid for that. So, an important trade good, which will leave us, or that important trade good will lead us to the idea of the early commercial networks and the trade in Africa. I would say pre-European contact, because we're going to include the contact of Islam was kind of important in the commercial networks. So you have the West African trade routes, basically main routes you could have, I guess not really in West Africa, you have the North African route, which can go between what would be thought as present-day Morocco to the city of Alexandria. And then you have the routes that will cross the desert, mainly camels, and mainly these will be Islamic traders going from North Africa to a southern area in Africa, or not South not a southern area in Africa, but going south through the Sahara towards the lands of West Africa and all across West Africa. It was really interconnected in a large trade route. You can trade many goods with many different people. Gold, a lot of things. You'd usually export maybe gold and maybe slaves, and then you'd import food and other goods made in the Islamic world, like goods from the Islamic world. So that's the main idea of the West African trade routes. It went, and once you went south through the Sahara Desert into West Africa, you could go east towards, I guess, what people would consider around the area of Sudan, and even a city on the Nile south of Egypt, so which was just connected through this West African trade route. Another idea is this interregional trade, as all these cities in West Africa were really connected, even what some could consider Central Africa. Interregional trade was really important, sometimes along rivers, sometimes along other trade routes. You could trade. This expansion of trade allowed just generally what trade does. If you don't have enough of one good, you can go get better goods somewhere else. A lot of resources that some people didn't have, they can now access. A lot better of just like not just trade decisions, but trade exchanges, as you have a lot more customers for certain goods, and you have a lot more places to get certain goods, even goods you couldn't get before. And then there's the internal slave trade. Basically, this is going to be the first time in the course slavery is mentioned. Well, I know it'll be mentioned a lot, especially further on in this video, but basically, this was a slave trade where women were more valuable than men, about 2 to 1. After a war or a battle, local chiefs and local groups would capture some slaves and then sell them. This was a large part of the economy for some of the early to even later in the period we're covering in this video, these West African states. Moving on to the bigger idea of African slavery. Slavery in European communities. Slavery in mainland Europe had existed for a while before the European colonizers went to take slaves from Africa to the Americas. And I guess the one example to focus on here is the slavery, I guess, from Africa to Europe, pre-European colonization / trading. Basically like in Italy and in some of the places of what I guess you could consider maybe the Kingdom of Aragon, maybe, or probably better would be said as the modern day area of Spain. So some of the North African Islamic traders would take African slaves, which came from West Africa or other places in Africa, could even be from Northern Africa, traveled up through the Sahara if they're from West Africa, or if they're just from North Africa. In both situations at this point, you'd travel up north by boat into Europe. There would be some African slaves there, living in Europe, working in Europe. Yeah, slaves in Africa, like I said earlier, local chiefs would take them. They're a large part of economic profit. It was more of a continuum rather than, the slavery in the United States. That was more like you're owned as property rather than you might have some rights. You might be able to do some things. You weren't just property. And slaves in status. Sometimes slaves being associated with wealthy owners provided them opportunities they wouldn't have if they weren't owned by these wealthy owners. So the wealthy owners, sometimes that, it would be a decision, but someone would have, they wouldn't make it if they're being a slave. But it's something to look at. It wasn't the worst, or it wasn't as bad as the worst slavery that we've seen, because some slaves could have extra status if they, were owned by a wealthy owner or a wealthy group. And like I said, the opportunities and the slaves in the economy, a large part of the Western African economy was slaves. This really what set up the Europeans trading for slaves. But in this early part, the African slavery there, like it went up to the Islamic world. Some Africans from West Africa, it went throughout the Islamic world. It was sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, it would go up to Europe. Sometimes in East Africa, it would also go through the Islamic world through the Swahili coast trade. So, and in the Indian Ocean. So yeah, slavery was around in a lot of places in basically African history. Next thing I'd like to discuss is the Great Empires. Basically, when you're going to be going to Unit 1, being tested on this on the AP exam, you will probably get some questions about this. The very content dense section or topic 1.5. First, you're going to begin with the early urban civilization in Gao. Gao basically in around 900 being this first urban or big urban center in West Africa. You having a city with indigenous Africans and Islamic traders from North Africa who came through the trans-Saharan trade routes. Living in another city, there's Islamic influence in both areas. Then you have the rise of Ghana, another one of these big empires in West Africa. Ghana gaining power through some of its gold resources, but also through expanding some of these trade networks, which the empire had. Ghana's trading empire is something big to remember about these three empires. Each of these three empires, there's something big you should remember. Ghana, it's really just some concept, just basically all these trading empires. How Ghana was able to connect the rivers and other trade routes with the other cities in West Africa, connect through possibly Central Africa, even a city in the Nile, or you should say much more of the Nile towards Sudan and like towards the basically where the river begins rather than Egypt land. And then you also have trade routes up north, the connecting with Islamic traders who are coming south to West Africa. The environment, though, as we've seen previously in this video, did affect Ghana. Crops failed. Mali then came to power. How was Mali the ones that were able to come to power? Well, basically, that was the conclusion of horse breeding. You have horses from North Africa, which are very strong, which Islamic traders bring south. Then you have a West African horses, which aren't susceptible to this fly, which kills horses. So basically, you need to make the horses from North Africa not die to flies, and you need to make the West African horses stronger. You crossbreed them. You have a horse which is strong and does not die to flies, which are present in West Africa. Mali used these horses, and we were able to take power. One of the main, or I guess the biggest ruler of Mali, or the big, huge empire of Mali, you could consider. There are these two empires that I'm going to be talking about. There's one main ruler. You should probably remember in some of their details about what they did. You have Mansa Musa, I guess maybe the most famous king of any of the empires from West Africa. Basically, his kingdom full of gold. He put tariffs on imports and exports and that, but he also went on this pilgrimage to the holy city of Islam. He went north first he went through his empire, then he went north to West Africa, all the way to Cairo, and then he went to the holy city of Islam in modern day Saudi Arabia. Basically, he did his pilgrimage. On the way there, he gave a ton of items, really. So some of these items which he gave are mainly gold, show off his wealth as he went towards or on his pilgrimage going to the holy city of Islam. Even on the way back, he also, I guess, kind of gave away, but maybe it's not just giving. He helped provide to build mosques in a lot of areas which did not have mosques. So that helped Islam. Basically, this huge show of wealth. On his way back, he went to, I believe, is the modern area of Tunisia, and he went met with some local, very powerful elites and a literary elite, and then went back through the Saharan Desert back to Mali. But what he showed the world, being this convert to Islam, and not only, showing Islam's effect in West Africa, but also he showed the wealth to Europe, to West Asia and Islamic world. This wealth of West Africa, this wealth of the Malian Empire, it's the main thing you'd think from Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. Then a little bit after, or some years after Mansa Musa died, Mali fell apart and you had Imperial Songhai take control. Imperial Songhai being this third and largest of these big empires in the history of West Africa. Songhai was the biggest empire, was, I guess it could be thought of as the biggest empire in West African history until the modern day. Songhai stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to what could be, I guess, modern day Lake Chad. So, this huge the thing in West Africa, the empire in West Africa was Imperial Songhai. One of the main leaders was Aski Muhammad. He had some reforms, but this was built off another pilgrimage, another Islamic king who went to the holy city of Islam. But what he did when he was in the North African cities and other Islamic cities was he tried to learn from local people. How can I better my empire? How can I do better? So, he learns, he codifies laws in his kingdom. He does some economic things to help the economy grow. He does other stuff like he improves education. He makes intellectual learning a bigger priority in his big city of Timbuktu. And then he also, helps increase literary values and such. But yeah, those are his main reforms. He's the main leader you want to remember from Songhai. Something, though, to think about with these great empires is the dichotomy of sovereignty. Basically, a lot of these kings we've been talking about, they're following Islam now, not traditional African cultures. What has existed in Africa for many years, these religious practices, the native Africans want to practice. So what they do there is the native Africans or I guess the Africans following a native religion, we don't want to, we don't want to go to Islam. The king's forcing us to follow his religion. We produce gold and bronze. Oh, we're going to send him less. So the king wants more gold and bronze, so they're going to be tolerant. Both kings we talked about, both that went on, well-known in West African history, both that went on these pilgrimages, they allowed a lot of a religious freedom for the local people. This real thing of the dichotomy of sovereignty is really the central government couldn't really always, and this happened in a lot of places in the world, couldn't always fully take over and crush the local governments. So, yeah. A final topic or idea or set of ideas which we'll be covering in this video is the idea of so we're going to look at a couple of things, or quite a few things actually here. We'll be looking at other states. First, we're going to start with the Mossi states. I believe in the southern end of the Niger River. These were the Mossi states existed, basically 5 states, which I guess you could use the words formed a union. You have a leader from each of the states and then one king who control the land. Main thing with them, we're never controlled by Ghana. We're never controlled by Mali. We're never controlled by Songhai. We're independent until the French took them over. So had to wait until the European colonization of West Africa to finally lose their independence. You have the Hausa states, modern day northern Nigeria, Islamic, a lot more of a, I guess, pastoral lands, cattle were a big thing in their lives. The Kingdom of Benin, also Nigeria, but now the southern part. And I believe I covered this. Do I? I don't know. I don't know if I have a video about Nigeria on my channel, modern day. But, you start seeing the shift between the religions. You have Christianity and Islam in the north, where Hausa in the south. yeah, south being Christianity, north being Islam. But you just see this in a separate empire. Benin, centered around Lagos, had this huge, powerful canoe navy, which were able to take a lot of control from other people just because you have this huge navy and you're on the water. So, you're able to do a lot with that. So, yeah, they were able to take a lot of the rivers near that area. Very powerful. And yeah, just I guess the main things to think about with that is canoes, very powerful navy. Then you have another important topic, the Christian Congo. So we've been talking about Islam, right? And Native African religions for a while. Have we talked about anything else? Not really. You go down south a little bit, you have the Christian Congo. Basically, Christianity flourished in Congo. One of the Congo kings in the late 1400s who wanted to be baptized Christianity adopted a Portuguese name, or I guess you could say Christian name, similar to Portuguese though. Joao, I think it's Joao the First, um, was his adopted name. You know, a lot of basically being in contact with a lot of Portuguese traders. The baptism of the king made Congo one of these early Christian states in, I guess, West Africa, or what you could call West Africa. And going down south, Mountain Ndongo, Matamba, modern day, I guess you could consider it Angola. Um, a much more, I guess, I don't know if the right word is egalitarian, but you had women and men kind of on the same scale, kind of. Women would go to war and do that type of stuff. Um, yeah, I mean, this is another kingdom which adopted Christianity. Along with the Christianity adoption, there were Portuguese backing certain sites, as you have seen, with the Portuguese trading in Congo. But yeah, so you have here, and then I guess you have like the Portuguese siding with a different side from a king died, and then there was like a son which could be next to rule. But then, like, the queen was like, he's, I think, around 8 years old, so she should rule. Um, Basically, the Portuguese went against her. Then she like got rid of, or she was a Christian. Then she dropped Christianity, and she adopted. Yeah, she went back to the African, like the native African religion of that area, and basically she led a fight with that against another Portuguese, or against the Portuguese backed ruler. Kind of ended in a stalemate. So not really much happened. So yeah, those are basically the main areas of what we could consider, or the main areas of not only what we could consider, but what is Westish Africa. Basically, like Africa that's facing the Atlantic Ocean. That's sub-Saharan Atlantic Africa, I guess, if that's a good way to term and explain it. Next, we're going to talk about a little bit of some stuff away from that. The Indian Ocean, the other side of Africa. Most of the slave trade was in the Atlantic Ocean. That's, I guess, where you're really building from here. But there was also some slave trade in the less regulated Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, you have the Great Zimbabwe, which was, I guess, we consider maybe a southeastern African culture. They're really, built from, I guess, Bantu languages, more something of an inland African culture, but then slowly went out, or this really powerful native group in Africa, which I guess it was the group on something we'll go into next, the Swahili Coast. They were the group in the Swahili Coast that were native to Africa, and they did a lot of trading, a lot of gold. Yeah, and then looking, I guess, at the final topic, or the final idea in this video, will be the Swahili Coast. The Swahili Coast, you can, if you go into world history, this is even a bigger topic, but you can even go more into this topic. So there's a lot to look at it, but looking at it in this context, it's basically, you have the native Africans, you have the Arabian traders, you have Persians, you have other Islamic peoples, maybe some Indian peoples, who are going throughout this whole cycle of, the Indian Ocean, using sails, using at some point some maps, basically, the whole monsoon patterns. how he able to trade and, being part of this huge lucrative in this historical period. We're looking at huge, it was very lucrative, this Indian Ocean trade. You had a lot of various cultures, maybe some more of a, not just the native African peoples lived here, but a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures. I believe you even had some later in history, probably not covered in the scope of this course. You had some West Asian countries colonize some of this area of the Swahili coast. So, you know, you have what, a lot of Zimbabwe, I guess, in the south, I guess Somalia in the north. Huge, like, this huge area of East Africa just being traded. A lot of different people living there. I guess something to note was, like I mentioned earlier, unregulated trade or slave trades. There are a lot of slaves in this area being traded a little later than the Atlantic slave trade. So that's going to be it for this video, which was generally about the early days of Africa and people living there up into what? So the early, I guess truly, yeah, the early humans in Africa to what I would consider the end of like the pure pre-European trading period. We've seen some European contact in the Congo and the Dongo Matamba with the Christianity and such, but yeah, where we're ending today is going to be the end of the European. Before the Europeans start making trades and doing a lot with slavery. And next time we'll go from the forts with European slavery and that type of thing, all that trading. So we'll finish unit 1 there, 25% of the course. A lot of the units have a lot more, or we'll have a lot more to explain. Yeah, but this is a pretty good review for unit 1. Then we'll go to the beginnings of unit 2, where we're going to talk about not just the capture in Africa, the forts and the Europeans in Africa, but we're going to go towards that trip. The Western Passage is a trip across the Atlantic for the slaves. And we're going to probably end with some Latin American slavery and some of the societal concerns of that. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you. Bye.